What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of Bogey Free, the second show tonight. We're going to be talking some running backs, and we are lucky enough to have Josh. You know him on Twitter at FantasyADHD. You can find his illustrious work and apps on Fantasy Insiders, and I think you've probably contributed to most sites that deal with fantasy on the internet at this point. So how are we doing tonight, man? What's going on?
I'm doing good, Matt. Things are good. I just bought a couple 6-packs of beer, so life is complete again. All is harmonious in my little neck of the woods. So happy to be on with you again, man. It's been fun. It's been a long time, and I'm ready to get after it.
Yeah, for sure. What are we drinking tonight?
We are having have a little Bell's Two Hearted here.
Nice.
And I've got this is a special out of Oklahoma City from a brewery called Co-op. This one's called Spare Rib. It's a pale ale. It's pretty good. And then the other one I'm going to crank out here. This is a super special local from a little town outside of Houston called Brenham. And you may not be able to read that. It looks backwards to me. But anyway, it's there's this little brewery outside of Brenham, Texas, it's in Brenham, Texas, called Brazos Valley Brewing. And they make amazing beer. Really good beer, especially their IPAs and pale ales. And this is one of their kind of one-off. They call it a B-side and rarity. And I'm looking forward to drinking it. It's a double dry hopped pale ale.
There you go. Living the dream. I got a local Blue Point Brewing, which of course was they kind of sold their soul to the devil a little bit, getting bought out by InBev, but they still have this, it's called Prop Stopper. It's a seaweed IPA, and it's like outrageous. It's very good.
Seaweed?
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. It's definitely in heavy rotation over the summer.
That sounds very bizarre. Like, so they actually infuse seaweed while they're brewing?
Yeah. It's pretty sweet.
That's insane. I would love to try that one time.
Yeah, it's I would imagine, I don't know if they if Blue Point makes it all the way down to you, but I would imagine at some point they will. Like I said, they were bought out by InBev, so they're kind of all over the place now.
Yeah, if it's InBev, it'll be here in like 3 months.
Yeah, exactly.
But to be able to look at.
Yeah. All right. So now that we got our beer talk out of the way, we can jump into some. I guess we could just really start off with some like general best ball strategy. I've been opening up with this with all the different shows that I've been doing with Hermsmeyer and Ray Summerlin the other day, and then Jennifer earlier tonight. How are you sort of approaching drafts when it comes to best ball this year? Is there a specific structure that you're going for, or is it sort of case by case?
I'm a leaf in the wind for the most part. I kind of play it as it comes to me. Now, do I adhere to standard best practices for roster construction? Sure. You know, I'm between 2 and 3 quarterbacks, 2 and 3 tight ends, 5 to 7 running backs, 6 to 8 wide receivers. So I stay within that relatively rigid structure. But outside of that, I'm not beholden to anything. I'll take pretty much any player that's on the board as long as I think they're a good value. And every player has a price point where they're worth taking for the most part. I mean, it's, we're talking about 240 players in most best ball drafts. So, or let me see if we're on draft, we're talking about slightly less than that. But either way, every player's got a price, and I'm not willing to pass on anybody as long as they're at the right spot.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And just going to, your roster construction sort of idea, last year, at least on draft, basically 96% of winning rosters had somewhere between 5 and 7 running backs. So if you got super lucky and you managed to win your league last year with more or less than that, then good on you. But for the most part, it's 5 to 7 is sort of the rule. And I would imagine it's pretty similar numbers over on MFL 10s as well. All right, so why don't we talk a little bit about the sort of like the top of the draft? Now, you can probably by the beginning of next week read my article about why I'm going 0 RB most of the time. But there's definitely an argument to be made for grabbing some of these guys up at the top, especially in best ball. If you're just trying to get exposure to people, I think that's an interesting part about being able to sort of build a portfolio when you're doing best balls. How do you, before we dive into specific players, how do you deal with sort of trying to get exposure to different guys? Is it an active thing that you're trying to do, or is it something that sort of just happens organically?
I think as long as you're willing to have an open mind in your draft and when I say an open mind, not be locked into certain players. So, every draft, you're not trying to take Jimmy Graham in the 6th round. As long as you're flexible in that regard, I think your exposure will naturally happen for the most part. I mean, do you need to sometimes reconsider a pick because you've drafted that guy, at least in the back of your mind 8 times in the last 10 drafts? Yeah, I think that's fine. Your subconscious is going to kind of direct you the way you probably need to go. Like, a lot of times your subconscious is smarter than your conscious mind, and instinctually will probably put you in more of a robust build than you might think you're really in at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So as we sort of get into these top guys, a couple of things I noted from looking through some win rates and things from last year. So 2 of the top 10 drafted running backs last year had double-digit win rates. That was Bell and Gurley. And 4 of the 14 running backs with double-digit win rates were drafted in the first 5 rounds of 12-team drafts last year. So that means that 10 running backs came from outside of the top 5 rounds in drafts last year, which I want to say that I'm surprised, because that is a pretty big number, that 10 of them out of the 14 came from outside. But does that seem like it makes intuitive sense to you? Does that sound about right there?
I think on the first cut, I think we're programmed to say that's BS. Like, there's no way that's possible. But on the second cut, it makes a lot of sense. Like, that's really how it should happen. In best ball, when you can't replace guys, the guys that are going to win your leagues are not the guys that you're drafting at the top, because you're already expecting them to contribute at least 12 weeks of scoring to your roster. It's going to be the guys that you get in the 11th round that end up falling into starter volume and produce at the first or second or third round level. For you to win a best ball league, you've got to have probably at least 2 guys on the roster that totally hit it out of the park for you. And I'm talking like they're swinging 8 or 9 rounds above their draft position. That's how you win best ball leagues, because otherwise, if everybody on your team performs to their ADP, you're not going to win. There's no way. So, I mean, you're going to finish right mid-pack more than likely. So, yeah, I mean, it's intuitively, it makes a lot of sense, but it does take a second for it to kind of click.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So when we're talking about sort of the top of the draft, as of the last 2 weeks on MFL 10s, according to your app, which I've been referencing on all of the shows, there's been 6 running backs that have been taken first overall. So I'm just going to go through them, and you can sort of pick, who you're most interested in. Are there any of these guys that you are sort of avoiding, or what are your general thoughts on the top here? So we have Gurley, Bell, DJ, Zeke, Kamara, and Kareem Hunt have all been, at least in one draft, picked at number 1 overall. So what has been your overall number 1, and how do you feel about some of the other guys being taken up there?
Yeah, my drug of choice at the 101 is David Johnson. And the reason I'm so on him as the 101 is he's the freshest running back of that bunch. He's got the least mileage on him. Obviously he missed pretty much all of last season. And before that, yeah, he was a workhorse in 2016. In 2015, he wasn't so much the workhorse until the end of the year. So he has pretty fresh legs. We know he's hungry. He's playing for a contract. And he's the de facto offensive weapon for Arizona. So we add all of those things together. To me, that's the 101. That's how you get there. Any surprises right there? You mentioned there's 6 players. I'm kind of surprised there are 6 running backs that have been drafted number 1 over the past 2 weeks. And I had to go refresh my app and look at it, and I see Kareem Hunt. That name sticks out like a sore thumb. And I would love to hear the reasoning behind that pick. And my guess is it's probably only one draft where he went to the 101. I'd love to hear it, because if somebody makes a compelling case for Kareem Hunt as 101, I'm all ears. I don't see it. But again, if I could see it, then I probably would have won a lot more than I did last year.
And to be fair, his spread has been Kareem Hunt's. His spread is much wider than the others, right? Gurley hasn't made it past the 4th overall pick. Everybody else that I listed, except for Hunt, has been at the latest a single-digit pick still. And Hunt has gone dropped all the way to 18 at least once, like you're mentioning. So I think that probably is like a Kansas City fan that got the first pick and went for it from a heart perspective, maybe. Or, hey, like you said, you can definitely tell yourself lots of stories, right? I mean, Ray Summerlin the other day was talking about his series, like Alternate Histories, where he sort of writes up like different stories that could have happened last year that would change ADPs this year. And I think that's a worthwhile like sort of skill to have, where you think about some guys that, like, what is the avenue for them really performing well? What's the avenue for them to sort of underperform, and how do you balance that, right? So typically I would say in most of the drafts that I've been in, DJ has been going usually 4th, sometimes 3rd. So if let's say you're 102 and you're deciding, DJ's already off the board, how are you differentiating between Gurley, Bell, Zeke? And I guess you could throw Kamara in there as well.
Yeah, I think you have to add Kamara in there. So my differentiation is I would say this is probably a weak argument, but to me, usage makes a lot of sense. And running backs that have a lot of recent miles on them, they always concern me. And so we know that Pittsburgh has zero qualms about running the wheels off of Le'Veon Bell. So I can't remember exactly how many touches he had last season, but it was probably up near 400. So, I mean, that guy's got a lot of wear and tear on him over the last, 2-3 seasons. And to me, that kind of scares me off a little bit. Now, is that narrative based? Yeah, probably. But again, I tend to think running backs wear down with carries over time. And the more carries you give a guy over a short period of time, it's concerning. So I kind of make him, he's like my number 3, number 4 right in there. Gurley, I'm not so concerned about, because his heaviest volume was last year. He's in a very creative offense. Now, did he have a great deal of splash plays that went for long yardage and touchdowns? He did. Absolutely. Will that regress? Probably so. But what we do know is that he plays in a very innovative offense that will feature him and give him lots of targets. In PPR format like MFL 10, I think he's ideal. I'd probably put him at running back 2. But in a half PPR format like draft, I would probably make him the 3. So that leaves us with Zeke Elliott and Alvin Kamara. I like Zeke Elliott a lot as the number 2 this year for a lot of the reasons I would have liked Gurley or Bell last year. That's because I know Dallas is going to try to destroy that man with carries and touches. And they don't care. They would be happy to give him the ball 600 times this year as long as they were winning. And even when they're losing, they're going to do it anyway because they're a dumb franchise. But that aside, that the volume that I see Zeke Elliott getting in that offense, it kind of sets him a little bit above Gurley and Bell. And then Kamara's like, I think you can mix him in at the 4 or 5 spot. My concern with him is that New Orleans has never really fully featured a running back in their offense. So there will be some volume concerns with Kamara. So at that point, you're pivoting a little bit saying, well, can he be as efficient as he was in 2017? I think that's a resounding no across everybody in fantasy football land. But it's possible that he could keep that up, right? I mean, we've seen it. He's done it before. That means it's in his range of outcomes now. Was it an outlier? Probably, but that doesn't mean that he can't still score, a dozen touchdowns this season and catch 80 balls. So I think if we can tell you talk about telling the story. I think if we tell the story about Alvin Kamara as 320 touches total and 80 of those are receptions, and he could score a dozen touchdowns in a really good offense, then I think you kind of make the case for RB4, RB5 pretty easily.
Yeah, and I think I think he's the most interesting case to me. I've found myself drafting him sort of the least, probably besides Zeke. Just I haven't really gotten a lot of exposure to Zeke. But when it comes to Kamara, it's like you have now the suspension with Ingram, right? Which has to be factored into his value. That has to give him at least a little bit of a bump. But not only that, you also have this idea that when did he really start getting any usage? Week 5 last year after the Peterson trade, right? So, I mean, I think that I said it to James Coe too on the show. Like, it's a similar situation to Tyreek Hill a couple years, like heading into last year, where you see this crazy efficiency, but if there's a bump in volume, does that make up for it? And you have to sort of parse that out yourself, right? Like, there's definitely a way that the volume makes up for some regression. Not all of it. If he goes back to being a 4 yards per carry or 3.8 yards per carry running back, and he's not breaking off these long plays, then it's a different story. But you're screwed regardless at that point, right?
Keep yourself together while I have a drinking problem over here.
Yeah. So outside of those guys, we're still seeing a lot of movement in running back in general, that like guys that could get into the first round. Like, besides them, you have Barkley going in the first round in most drafts, I would say. You have Melvin Gordon going in quite a bit. You have Fournette there. You have Cook. You have McCaffrey sliding in there at some points. You have McKinnon before the injury, which we'll get to the other laundry list of injuries in a few minutes. But once you get out of that, I don't want to say can't miss, because any of these guys can get hurt, but we really consider, at least I consider, those top 4 or 5 guys, like, given health, they're going to perform and come pretty close to paying off their ADP. Is there a favorite if you're sort of drafting at the turn that you have here? Are you going with Fournette or Gordon, or trying to snag Barkley? What are your thoughts, sort of that back half of the RB1s?
Yeah, so the back half for me, it's a lot of Fournette and it's a lot of Dalvin Cook, and I like their youth. I like that they don't have a lot of mileage on them, and I think they're going to be in good offenses this year on teams that are winning. It really, running back, it kind of boils down to teams that are winning, and teams, those teams tend to give their running backs more volume, and volume leads to yards and touchdowns with running backs. So I don't see any reason why you would really want to get Barkley. I have some Barkley because I know, at least I trust that he's going to get some volume. I feel pretty confident that Pat Shurmur's a good offensive coordinator, can scheme his man open. I do have some concerns about game script. Now, if he's going to be a 3-down back and be receiving passes, regardless of whether they're down 10 or up 10, then, the story changes a little bit. But for me at the turn, I'm looking at Leonard Fournette, I'm looking at Dalvin Cook, and every once in a while I'll sprinkle in some Kareem Hunt. I have some workload concerns with Kareem Hunt, because I think that Spencer Ware is probably going to be more of a thorn in his side than many think. Yeah.
And he's completely free. If you do want to grab him in a couple of drafts just in case, I can't. I'm not even scrolling down far enough to figure out where he is at this point. So he seems like very much the forgotten man that could end up being a bit of a pain. So as we get at it, like past those guys that are in the first round, who are some other guys that you're willing to take in sort of that like first 3 to 4 round range that you're pretty confident in, whether it's workload or, are there guys that you're completely avoiding in this range? How are you viewing like the RB2 sort of tier?
Yeah, I do like Christian McCaffrey a lot. I think his price is a little high, so I don't have a lot of exposure to him because I think his upside is already baked into the cost. So that's always a problem for me. And, we talked about it a few minutes ago. If you're going to win your best ball league, you have to blow up ADP at a few positions. And you're not going to do that drafting guys at their ceiling ADP. You just can't do it. So, while I like McCaffrey's prospects this year, I can't draft him for a simple reason. He costs too much. So the guys I look at are primarily Jordan Howard. I look at Derrick Henry quite a bit, as his prices kind of stayed the same over the last couple months. And then the other guy I really am kind of gaga over is Alex Collins for Baltimore. And I have a lot of exposure to those three running backs because I feel like any one of those three running backs could, end up as a top 5 running back this season. And, if I could get that player at the end of the second into the middle of the third, maybe sometimes even the late third, early fourth, I love that prospect. That's where Todd Gurley was last year. If we think about it, Todd Gurley was the 22nd pick off the board a lot of times and sometimes got up, all the way out to 30. So, and he won your league.
Right.
So that's typically where I look for the running backs that I'm going to be most heavily on during my best ball drafts is the guys that are right there in that range that I think can jump all the way up to, first round production.
Yeah. And from sort of a bird's eye view of your, building your portfolio, are you, I know you said you sort of try to take it organically, but is there a point in drafts where you're really trying to concentrate and pick, like, really go all in on guys, or do you really find that you sort of spread it out depending on how the draft is going?
I tend to spread it out a little bit. Yeah. I'll say this. I got bit in the ass pretty hard last year going all in on Kenny Britt. And I deserve all the slings and arrows that I received for, touting Kenny Britt so hard last year, but there was a lot to like in that situation. That's what I saw. I saw the rainbows and the sunshine and decided to overlook all the storm clouds that had surrounded him his entire career. That's on me. That's my fault. And I haven't done that this year. I've been very careful about it. Now, are there some guys that I've just totally gone ham on? You bet. Like Emmanuel Sanders, bar none, dude. I have that guy in probably 60% of my leagues.
Yeah.
Just because I feel so strongly about his ability and his situation and his ADP being such a ridiculous value all offseason that I'm fine drafting him. I would be happy to take him in the 3rd round right now. Totally fine taking him in the 3rd round over Demaryius Thomas. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to do that. That's the good thing. I don't have to do it. But, he's one of those guys that I just totally lose it for.
Yeah, I think it's obviously dependent on how many drafts you're doing, but I've found myself sort of trying to take some stands at different points in the, since draft has started offering the contest, because obviously prices changed drastically since, I started drafting this year probably in like April or whatever it was. So things changed dramatically, and guys' prices now don't necessarily reflect what they were, right after the draft. But it's very interesting, like building a portfolio in best ball. This is the first year that I've really sort of gone in and done a lot of drafts. So it's been an interesting learning experience, and hearing from other people who know what they're doing is always nice. So you mentioned those 3 that you do like, and just I saw a tweet earlier from Pro Football Focus that Alex Collins had their highest rushing grade last year, for whatever that's worth, over Hunt and Gurley and Cook and CJ Anderson were the other 4. I thought CJ Anderson was a little interesting there too, but
I think that's very interesting. We should probably take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Actually, I take it back. I said that wrong. I think we need to take that at some face value. CJ Anderson's good.
Yeah.
He's a good player.
Yeah, I would say that he, and like once I get to him, I'm pretty comfortable taking him at his ADP. I've been tweeting about it. We've been talking about it. I'm much more in on 0 RB than not in most drafts. And I would say if I looked right now, he's probably in, 30 to 40% of my teams, just because of where the price has been most of this offseason. And you can still get him, like, depending on the draft, you can get him like pick 100 pretty easily. So he's a guy that's been interesting. I did want to get your thoughts sort of in this range with the Collinses of the world and the Derrick Henrys. What are your thoughts on Lamar Miller for this upcoming year?
I'm kind of lukewarm on him. I think he's okay. Like his price is fine. I think his upside is pretty limited. That's why I prefer to take the players that are around him a lot more. So Miller, I think there's a lot of ceiling already baked into his price. If he were a 6th rounder, I would be much more amicable toward his price. But right now, it's just I think it's a little bit too high, and you're kind of hoping for the best if you pick him where he's going.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I do think his price has crept up a little bit. I think over the past few weeks, although it hasn't gone up as much as I thought it was going to, because it seems like everybody has been talking about how like underrated and how cheap Lamar Miller was for a bit there. It looked like there was sort of a stretch on fantasy Twitter that everybody was talking about it. And I thought he would get a little bit more of a bump, but I think he only went up a couple spots as far as running backs go.
Yeah, he won't get that bump. There's too much narrative attached to him already, right? Because, ever since his days in Miami, he's viewed as this just total washout failure of a running back. And people remember that stuff, and they don't forget it easily, and they assign it to his ADP.
Yeah, the only thing worse than the fantasy football community about stuff like that is the fantasy golf community.
Yes.
Talk about a grudge-filled community. It's really, I'm like, number one on that with guys like Keegan Bradley and whatnot. But
I'm building a list, buddy. I have a list already in the works.
So all right, we've talked about some guys that you like and don't like at the top. In this sort of middle range, once we get to say once we get past like Lamar Miller, I think that a lot of these guys can be viewed as somewhat interchangeable depending on what you're looking for. So who are some of the guys that you're targeting? Like not like super deep flyers, but just like middle round sort of, whether you're looking at like the Marshawn Lynch's of the world or Duke Johnson or Kerryon Johnson, like who Rex Burkhead is in that range too. Like who are you targeting in the middle?
Yeah, so middle guys for me, I'm pretty high on Marshawn Lynch this year. He got a slow start last year, but it wasn't his fault. They wouldn't give him the damn ball. Yeah. So once they finally decided to use their running game in Oakland last year, he balled out like he has balled out for the last 7 or 8 years. So I'm really high on him. I think he's still got plenty of gas. I don't think that's going to be an issue for him. So I really like him. Kerryon Johnson, I'm starting to really kind of get the itch for. After seeing some of his work in the preseason game last week. Does he have some hurdles around him? Absolutely. But I think he may be the type of player that can push those hurdles aside and commandeer, 60 to 65% of the workload there. I think, if anybody could do that, probably a player like him. He's kind of a do-it-all guy, even though he didn't get to do it all at Auburn. Marlon Mack, I'm looking at a lot of Marlon Mack now. I know he's kind of hurt right now, but I think that's a good thing for his price. I mean, his price has fallen. He's fallen 5 draft spots in the last 2 weeks. And, I made a post on Twitter yesterday about the Indianapolis running backs. They're kind of going back into the buy window, both, Marlon Mack and Nyheim Hines and Jordan Wilkins. I mean, all 3 of these guys I think are worth buying and scattering across your rosters because I believe they will be attached to a very prolific offense and they're all going to get chunks of it. So I think at the right price, it's worth having every one of those guys on your rosters. Aaron Jones, I really like him a lot. Now, I'm not saying that because Jamal Williams hurt his ankle tonight. I'm saying that because I think he's the most talented running back in Green Bay. And typically that talent will rise to the top. Now, Mike McCarthy's kind of a numbskull, and he plays guys that aren't really that good sometimes outside of Aaron Rodgers, and he puts them in bad situations. But I think Aaron Jones can do everything that Green Bay needs a running back to do. And obviously, if Jamal Williams is hurt, then Jones's ADP is going to start spiking pretty quickly. So, if you can draft him tonight, it might be the time to do it. And then lastly for me, CJ Anderson, we just talked about him. CJ Anderson is really more of that prototypical Norv Turner type back. He can go both ways. He can play like LaDainian Tomlinson played in San Diego when Norv Turner was riding him so hard. And, can McCaffrey do that? We don't know yet, right? Because the book on him last year was he couldn't run between the tackles. Right. He's a great pass catcher, though. So, do we think those guys could be on the field at the same time? Teams talk about it all the time. They never do it. So we'll probably throw that out the window. But I think there's an opportunity here that I think there's a small possibility that CJ Anderson takes over the lead role in Carolina. And let's say he takes over 55% of the work there. Maybe just a slight lead running back role, but enough of one to where you could say in the 9th round, he's a steal.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Anybody who's listened to this show last year during DFS season would hear me and Halupka arguing constantly about Christian McCaffrey, and I was not on the pro side. So, and just going back to what you were mentioning about Marshawn Lynch, because I have a Seahawks jersey of Marshawn Lynch. Like, I'm the biggest Lynch guy ever. He, in the second half of the season last year, in half-point PPR, so we're talking about like draft, he was averaging 14 points a game compared to under 6.5 points per game in the first half. So he definitely came on, whether that was rust or usage or whatever the case was. It for our purposes, it probably doesn't matter because he got that year off. He seems to be back. He looked good the other night in the preseason game. So he's somebody that I'm targeting. And Kerryon Johnson just seems to keep popping up where I'm really willing to take like I'm probably getting him as like my RB like 3 a lot of the time, just because I'm going heavy on wide receivers a lot. But I think that makes I think he makes a lot of sense when you see plays like he put together in the preseason. It's one of those things where you hope that he can carry that into the regular season. While we're in this range, though, I did want to get your take on the Cleveland backfield too, because it seems like nobody sort of knows like what the hell to do because all 3 of these guys are right next to each other in ADP. Is it a situation that you're trying to get some value out of, or do you think that it's a pretty, easily, I guess, like fadeable situation?
I think it's probably easy to fade the situation because the player that you really want out of that offense, out of the running offense, Duke Johnson, is pretty expensive. Like he's firmly in the 8th round. Or in the 7th round. And I have a hard time paying 7th round prize for Duke Johnson or really any other kind of satellite back like him, even though I think he's going to get a lot of volume. The issue with Cleveland is that they're probably still going to be a bad team. Bad teams don't get to run the ball in the second half of games. They throw the ball. So, you gravitate toward the satellite back. The problem is, we just talked about it, his cost. So I've been avoiding Cleveland altogether from the running back unless a player like Carlos Hyde slips into the 10th round. And I've seen it happen a few times recently on draft. Mm-hmm. And in that case, especially if I've gone wide receiver heavy to open a draft, I'll take a swing at Carlos Hyde. I think Carlos Hyde is a good player. And I think in the right situation, and let's say Cleveland wins 6 or 7 games this year, which not very likely, but I think it could happen. If they win 6 or 7 games this year, he probably gets enough volume to where he's productive at that price. That's okay. I can deal with that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's another one. He's gone anywhere from 30th to 116th overall. Like the spread on some of these running backs is it's unpredictable, and you at a certain point just sort of have to be like, all right, this is probably a price that these guys can pay off once you get to a certain point. So, I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot else in this middle range. So who are some flyers that you're thinking about? I would like your take on Eckler, because I don't even think we mentioned really or spoke about Melvin Gordon. So is it a situation where you think Eckler could have some value, or what are your thoughts there?
I like Melvin Gordon. I just haven't been drafting him. And I don't have an excuse for it. I don't have a reason for it. It just really hasn't happened for some reason or other. And it's typically, the spots where I would take Melvin Gordon, I take Julio Jones. I take Michael Thomas, because I kind of adhere to zero RB principle. And I feel like if I can get, a Jordan Howard or an Alex Collins, or, once upon a time, Darius Geis as my RB1, that was going to be my path. That was how I was going to try to succeed. And that would lead me away from the other guy. So from Melvin Gordon. So Eckler, I'm not crazy about Eckler. I think he's a little small. Can he get some passing down work? And, can he get some work when they're behind, game script work? Yeah, I think it's possible. But, there's a lot of other players I would rather take there. I'd rather take Frank Gore around there. I'd rather take Spencer Ware around there. The other running backs I look at in that area, if they slip, I'll look at Peyton Barber. I look at Matt Breida. Matt Breida's price has slipped a little bit since he got dinged up. That's a good thing for us because he's a value now. Latavius Murray, if he drops, then I'm looking at him at that area. So, Eckler just kind of doesn't factor into the equation for me right now.
Yeah, I think that's fair. What are your thoughts on the Jets backfield? Is that a similar situation to the Cleveland backfield for you, or do you think there's some value to be had there?
It's not anymore. It was before McGuire got hurt, but I was a big fan of McGuire as a 18th round pick before he was injured, because I thought McGuire probably had the most robust skill set of that backfield, and eventually I think late season that's a guy I could see just taking over the backfield and kind of taking the role on for himself. But obviously that's up in the air. So now once he's up in the air, I'm actually hitting Bilal Powell pretty hard in the 11th round. And after that, if I can get him to slide, because I think he's probably going to have the most consistent role on that offense. It's been that way the past couple of seasons. It's worked out that way because the Jets haven't been a good team. And he's been, for the most part, the most available running back on their roster. He's been the guy that's remained the healthiest, and availability for running back that's key. That's number one. If he ain't on the field, then he's definitely not getting touches. But so for me, Powell, I look at Powell a lot now as kind of a, running back 4, running back 5, that especially in MFL 10s that are PPR, that's, to me, that's kind of a destination for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. And I guess maybe the last specific situation question. We obviously Geis went down. I don't know. What are your thoughts on Chris Thompson? I personally am a little concerned about the news that he doesn't feel like he's going to be 100% until, once we get sort of into the season. I don't know how much of that is, preseason nonsense, which we can tend to run into a little bit. But do you think that there's some value to be had there with maybe like a Pirine or a Kelly, or do you think it's probably Thompson and nothing else?
I think it's okay to sprinkle in some Kelly and some Pirine based on their prices. I mean, you can get these guys after the 15th round. So if you're probably drafting them as your RB5, RB6, Pirine and Kelly, there's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of YOLO stuff there. You're not relying on those guys, but if they hit, they hit. Thompson, the news came out before Geis's injury about him being slow to come back, probably until November. And Geis's injury has totally reinvigorated his ADP. So over the last week alone, he is up 2 rounds in the last week since the Geis injury. That just blows my mind, because you're now drafting Chris Thompson at roughly the 61st pick at the end of the 5th round for a player that may not be fully healthy until November. Man, I don't know about that. So I have 0 shares of Thompson this year because of his price. It's just been astronomical all offseason.
Yeah. And I think, if we're going to talk about, a regression candidate, he definitely, I would say, sort of produce touchdowns at a rate that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see, sort of consistently from year to year, at least. So real quick before I let you go, I've been wrapping up with this for best ball in general because I know some people are listening to this and don't know what even draft or MFL 10s are, but are just sort of listening for a running back conversation. How do you approach like these conversations about running backs for best ball versus how you approach, say, like a traditional redraft, whether it's PPR, half PPR, whatever? How do you sort of deal with balancing like like how are you approaching drafts basically?
Yeah, so for best ball, I will typically try to get a guy in the first 3 to 4 rounds, or maybe 2 running backs in the first 3 to 4 rounds that I feel confident in their volume. In like a pure redraft league where I can hit waivers, I'm not doing that. I'm hitting wide receivers unless, for some reason a player slips. But if running backs aren't going to slip in these drafts, not in redraft. I mean, because running back is at the top of everybody's mind after the last season. So you're better off being a little bit contrarian and loading up at wide receiver because the value is awesome at wide receiver. And then just, shotgunning running back and then hitting waiver wires and getting your running backs. These guys get hurt or as people reveal themselves and, just running zero RB, because I think at the end of the day, zero RB is probably going to be the most plus EV strategy you can use in your redraft leagues.
Yeah, I obviously agree. It's something that I think people get away from sort of anecdotally. And, they drafted Todd Gurley last year, so they think they have to go running back early. Or, they even to sort of get to zero RB, like, oh, I drafted David Johnson first. Like, I'm never drafting a running back early ever again. I think people probably overreact to like one-off situations that they had to deal with. And I think that it's you really have to play the odds. And for best ball, if you're drafting a ton, then sure, take some shots and play around with some different builds for your roster. But if you're talking about redraft, I mean, I'm drafting on Sunday and Monday with some of my more important leagues. So I'm giving away a little bit of the secret sauce here, but there's no way I'm drafting running back in the first couple of rounds for sure. Yeah, so that's I think is going to do it for us. Thanks for hopping on with me as always, Josh. Hopefully we'll talk at some point in season as well. And obviously we'll be going back and forth with our beer 30s on Twitter as well.
Right on, man. And excited for the birth of your first one. Good luck with that.
Thank you. Any day now.
Yeah, a few sleepless nights in your future, but don't worry. You have fantasy football to keep you company while you're rocking a newborn to sleep. So
there you go. Just throw in a podcast or do a couple of drafts preseason and call it a night.
Yep, it was made for that.
Exactly. All right, man. Thanks a lot for joining me again. As we set up at the top, you can follow Josh on Twitter at FantasyADHD. You can find me at Matt Jones TFR. And good luck in your drafts. This is it for the best ball episode. So good luck, and we will talk soon. See you.